Our next speaker is Mike Morrice. And Mike Morrice is the Executive Director of the Sustainable Waterloo Region. And a couple of things about Mike. He was recently accepted in this program called Ashoka, which is basically a program, it's quite prolific because not very many Canadians are part of this, but it basically helps take great sustainable ideas and scale them. And he's one of only 30 or 40 people that in Canada that have been accepted in this program, so I think it's a really remarkable achievement. And then one personal thing I want to say about Mike is that he says this, his highest paying job was actually driving a Zamboni. And you can talk about that to him later when we get to our breaks, because again, you should be talking to speakers. See? So please give a warm welcome to Mike Morrice.
Be back on the Laurier campus again, and it really feels like home. So thank you for having me here. In December 2009, our political leaders from across the globe met in Copenhagen, Denmark. This was one of many conferences you might remember since Rio in '92, where they were attempting to get a global deal on climate change, a legally binding agreement on greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, I found myself at a coffee shop in Toronto, and I was pretending to be doing work, but what I was really doing was clicking refresh on my browser over and over again, because these political leaders were in the last dying seconds of the last extended negotiation to get this deal. Some of you who have a good memory will know that they didn't get a legally binding deal in Copenhagen on climate. They hadn't received one in the 17 years before that, and they haven't gotten one since. And no matter how many times I pressed F5 on my keyboard, it didn't change the outcome one bit. And it's in moments like that that I find it can be so disheartening looking at the global challenges we face. That when I put my hopes in political leaders in faraway places and in agreements being made nowhere near where I am, this world's a difficult place. But when I look to local communities, when I place my hope in what's happening right around me, I find this world just shines a little bit differently. We've got examples in the last year, right, from the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street. In the last 100 years, everything from civil rights to suffragette, these movements have one thing in common, one binding tie, and that's that they started at the local level. They started in communities, and they started in small groups of people. And so today what I'd like to share with you is some of my experience in igniting a local movement here in Waterloo Region. And so I want to start with you with about 6 years ago. And I say it feels like home being here. It's because I was an undergraduate student here. I was in my 4th year at Laurier. And I was in a double degree program in business and computing and computer electronics, meaning I wrote business plans and built robots. Those are the two things. And I was in the co-op stream, and so I had just finished a co-op term at a large tech company in Mississauga. And I was also in the midst of, as many of us do in undergrad, really figuring out what my passions were. And for me, that meant that I was steeped in books from the likes of Daniel Quinn and Paul Hawken, Derek Jensen and Bill McKibben. And I was really in the midst of figuring out a bit of a different perspective, coupling together more of an ecological worldview that was very different from that of my parents' generation. And in particular, I want to give you an example. I was living on Hemlock Street, just a couple hundred meters away. And I was on the phone with my former employer. My boss's name was Tim. He was calling me from Mississauga, and Tim was in the midst of offering me a second term to return to that employer again. And I was on that phone, and I remember that I knew taking that job meant I'd have to hop back in my mom's Chevy Cavalier and commute an hour to and from Mississauga every day, 5 days a week. And in my head at that time was this clash between this new ecological perspective and this passion and this career path that I was already on. And we hear so often how it is so important to know your passion. But for me, this was different. This was about actually imagining what my passion and my career could be if they were the same thing. And I wasn't ready for that yet. I took that job. It was a great job, great term. But it wasn't until a whole term later that I decided, you know what, I just wouldn't do co-op at all. You can do that. I decided I would go to conferences. I would phone up people I didn't know that I thought were in this field, this ecological field. I just didn't even know what that meant, but I'd call them anyway. And I'd spend time more exploring what this passion meant. When I got back on campus, I found a prof who was willing to explore carbon policy research with me, which is essentially the intersection between business and the environment. But what I want you to take away from this is that it's more than just finding your passion. That for me, it required some grittiness later on down the road. It required that perseverance. And that perseverance and that grittiness came directly from ensuring that what I was doing in my 40 hours a week, and I got a lot of 40 hours, a lot of weeks left, and that was the same thing as that which I was passionate about. Now, coming back on campus, I wanted to get out of some more courses, and you get credit for these research courses. And so I did this first one in carbon policy, and then I found this prof, and the dean of business was willing to allow me to then write a business plan for this new idea. And a friend of mine were inspired by a group operating on the West Coast about the ways that maybe a new entity could work with businesses and help organizations make real commitments to reduce their environmental impact. Because we knew there's a business case. We knew that there is going to be carbon policy soon. We know that companies will save money by reducing their energy impact. We knew that they'd improve their brand, that they'd attract employees that look like you and me. And so we said, okay, what if we created this new thing? This new organization who would work with businesses, give them the supports, connect them to networks and resources and expertise, and then report back on their behalf. And by doing that, what if we actually changed the culture of businesses in Waterloo Region to one that actually integrates environmental sustainability into the decision-making of organizations across this community? Now get this, the flagship program we were going to create was going to have companies make commitments, and they were going to pay us a membership fee to do it. That was the idea. You can imagine my first few pitches to companies. How about you make a commitment to reduce your carbon impact and pay me to do it? What do you think? So what did we do? We dreamed real big, and we started talking about it. To anybody that would listen, and what I learned at this time in my life is if you write a coherent email, people generally write you back. And so we emailed the mayor, and we emailed the big tech companies and the big leading faculty, and we told them about what we wanted to do. And we didn't just talk about it, but we listened to what their priorities were, and we adapted what we were thinking based on that. And so we kept talking into the summer of 2008, and by the end of the summer, we had this audacious goal of having $100,000 of initial project funding for this new entity we wanted to create. Can you guess how much funding we had? It's not a fairy tale. We didn't have 100. We had 10,000, and the only funder was my research prof, who oversaw the whole research the whole way. Later told me he was just betting on a horse. And the closest likeness I can give you is that dancing video. He was like the second crazy guy dancing. And then it got a bit worse. Because if you remember back in 2008, what happened? This big recession thing hit. So fast forward to November 2008, I'd presented to over 100 companies, asking for them to be these corporate sponsors of this new organization we wanted to create. None of them signed on. I can remember very clearly this meeting we had with the volunteer team. It's always, everything I've done in the last 6 years has always been volunteer driven, and we had our 12 volunteers in a room, these people that had been committing so much of themselves to this idea. And I remember we essentially just brainstormed crazy ideas to keep this thing going. And the worst idea, I remember, was this idea of recycling car tires. I'm glad we never did it. But it even got to the point where I actually had my exit strategy written down. For those of you that aren't business students, what an exit strategy means essentially the list of people I will disappoint if I stop. Having to go to the prof to say it didn't work, and the volunteers to say we wasted your time. And so I don't want it to come across that dreaming big and talking is enough to create a movement. It's not. But what we were doing at that time, we were literally planting the seeds of the movement we were trying to build. We were literally investing in our supporters across this community for what would follow. So what followed? What was our TSN turning point? What was the big idea? It's so simple, it's ridiculous. On January 28th, 2009, one of the snowiest days, of course, because we're in Canada, we hosted an event. And we invited out a tech leader from the West Coast, from a business that had reduced their environmental impact and made a profit while doing it, and we asked that person to come speak to our community. And we invited all those people that weren't ready to step up and sponsor to just come to this event. And what happened? On the feedback forms afterwards, the most common feedback we received is that I only expected 20 other people in the room, and oh my gosh, there were 200. That by simply getting our supporters in one room together, that alone built the credibility of what we were trying to do. That we literally brought this movement into one room and said, look, who else is here? Oh my gosh, the mayor's here. Those tech companies, they showed up too. Those political leaders, they're all here. Wow. And what followed? 2 weeks later, the mayor joined our advisory board. A few weeks after that, those companies that attended that event, they later joined as partners, as sponsors. Within a few weeks after that, in the midst of a recession, we had put together over $200,000 of project funding for this new crazy idea. We started to make it happen. But I want to be very careful. That money is not what builds movements. Money's a start, but money's not sufficient. Money only builds empires, not impact. And it definitely doesn't build a movement. So what does? Movement building is about involving people in the process of what you're trying to create. So let me give you our example. We had this whole idea about getting companies to make commitments. Well, a really big decision we had to make is how these commitments would be made. If company ABC is going to commit, how ambitious are these commitments going to be? What year are we going to compare against? What about carbon offsets? What are we going to do about those? We had a lot of choices to be made, and we could have come to the community and said, this is how it's going to be. Do you want to play? Here's what we did instead. Those 200 people that came to that event, we invited them out to a working group. We said, how about you come to this event? You can volunteer your time, and we'd like to hear from you how this framework should work. You tell us how this is going to be. So we spent 6 months in that process. And that's exactly what they did. At the end of that process, here's what happened. A mechanical engineer from a local tech company, for example, came up to me afterwards. His name's Dave. And Dave said, Mike, this sounds really awesome. Now, Dave wasn't the decision maker. He wasn't the CEO. We weren't getting those kinds of people out to our events. But Dave said, I feel like I'm a part of this. Would it be okay for me to connect you to my management team? I said, would that be okay? That'd be great. I'd love that. And I pitched to Dave's management team a few months later. And this organization ended up being our 4th member of this regional carbon initiative, this flagship program we'd been talking about. And the first 3 that were all on board at the launch event, well, they were all attendees too. In fact, of the 25 people we had in that working group, 20 of them now work for organizations that either have intention or have made commitment to reduce their carbon impact. What about inside the organization? I mentioned before about Copenhagen. I mentioned we're volunteer-driven. It is very difficult for you and I to hop on a plane and go to Copenhagen. In fact, it probably costs a lot of money too, and has a massive carbon impact. You're probably not going to go to Mexico anytime soon or South Africa either. But I can tell you it's pretty easy to hop on a bus and head to downtown Kitchener and come to a team meeting once a week. To have a real voice in the decision-making of how we're growing this movement, and to have real input and impact in what we're doing. As a result of that, our team today remains volunteer-led. We're 60 volunteers and 6 staff. And these volunteers, they don't just sort paper. They hire our staff. Our marketing team, our finance team, all volunteers. And why? Because they actually have a say in what the organization does. Those volunteers, those members of those working group, what's in common? They feel like they're a part of what we're doing. And why do they feel like they're a part of it? Because they actually are. So then, we launched this new initiative in June of 2009. It's been about 4 years since that time. And the common thread since we started it, a focus on results and real impact. That I can tell you we've got X staff and X volunteers, and you haven't actually done anything yet. You just got people standing around. What have we actually done? I can tell you this. We have 50 organizations of every size and sector across this community. As large as Sun Life and Ernst & Young, as small as Athena Software. Local government, nonprofits, they're all a part of this. And each of those doesn't just have a logo on a website. They either have intention to make a commitment or they've already done so. And those that have made commitments, those commitments total almost 45,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. That's about 10,000 cars off the road every year. And that's just one of 4 programs we now offer across Waterloo Region, in addition to policy work, which we've now started to do that helps build in to this kind of service-based work. Beyond the quantitative results, qualitatively, I can tell you when I go to Rotary clubs, and we have 6 of the 7 largest insurance companies across Waterloo Region that are now part of this. I can tell you the first question I get when I finish a presentation is, where's that 7th largest insurance company? That increasingly, organizations are actually conspicuous by their absence. That the expectation is that they're a part of this. That's where you start seeing a change in culture, a change in the mainstream, a change in the way businesses operate in Waterloo Region. And the coolest part, when you can point to real results and real success, people notice. And so a few years ago, Evan DeValentino was a prof at Niagara College. And Evan came out to one of our events, and he got pretty psyched up, and afterwards he said, Mike, I love this work you guys are doing. Would you be willing to share your business plan with me? I said, sure, that sounds okay. I'd love to do that. And then, he started working with volunteers and trying to raise funding and realized he needed some coaching and support. And so he said, well, would you be able to chat with me about this every now and then? So we started up some Sunday afternoon phone calls. And then Sandy from Hamilton called, and then a guy from London and a guy from Sarnia, and all of a sudden, Sunday afternoon phone calls moved to the workday. But wait, my role, my job's all about Waterloo Region. What am I doing coaching other communities? In fact, the real epiphany was when the Niagara Sustainability Initiative launched in January of 2011. They asked me to speak at that event, and I did that. And then in the car on the way home, I'm thinking, wow, I should be in Waterloo Region right now. What am I doing? And so at the next board meeting, I brought this up with the board, and I said, we got a big question on our hands here. How and who and if we should even continue to be coaching these other communities, I'm not sure we should do. Here's some options. And that same second crazy guy, now the chair of the board, that research prof from way back from my undergrad days, it was Barry that stopped. I said, Mike, it's not a question of if we're going to do this. Don't forget, climate change isn't local. This is not a Waterloo Region issue. This is a global challenge. Someone has to do this. We have to figure out who's going to do it. And when Barry speaks, I listen. That's what we did. We then went back to a reliable funder and asked them for some money to then do some research to figure out how we're going to continue to share this model. How are we going to continue to connect it to the bigger picture? And so over the last year, that's exactly what we've done. We're now in the midst of starting a new national entity. And this new national entity's role will be to coach and enable and support communities, not just to work with businesses, but to work with them in a way where they're measuring real action, they're getting real commitments with local autonomy and local decision making. We are not going to franchise anything. Every bit of any success we've had has been because everything is local, that everyone is involved and part of the decisions. That's exactly what we're now in the midst of doing. But really interesting for me, maybe ironic, is that I feel like I'm exactly where I was back in 2008. I feel like I'm exactly where I was when we were dreaming really big and talking it into reality. Once again, our backs are up against the wall. We don't know exactly where funding is going to come from. We don't know exactly how it's going to work, but we know we've got this idea, and we know that these communities and this country needs real action on climate change. And so we're dreaming big again, and we're not sure how exactly it's going to work out. But once again, my hope for what we're doing is in the local. Because you know more than anybody else that our generation together has inherited a whole whack of problems. That's not going to surprise anybody. But that there are solutions in communities. That you and I can be part of a movement that changes the results in real ways, that shapes the outcome. And that you and I, that we can actually be a part of the change we want to see in this world. Thank you.